December 17, 1944. Near the Belgian town of St. Vith. Snow drifts across the Ardennes forest, muffling the chaos of battle. Private Karl Weber, 21 years old, crouches behind the charred remains of a Panzer IV, his rifle frozen in his hands. The thunder of American artillery rolls through the hills, shaking loose the frost from shattered pines. Around him, what was once a proud Wehrmacht battalion is dissolving into confusion. Orders have stopped coming. Radios have gone silent. The counter-offensive, the grand promise of the Führer's Ardennes miracle, is dying in the cold. Weber's breath catches as the distant rumble of tanks grows louder. He peers through the haze and sees olive-drab Sherman tanks advancing, white stars gleaming against steel. The Americans. For a moment he thinks of running, but where he has not eaten properly in days. His boots are split, his fingers numb. Beside him, Sergeant Miller whispers, "It is over, Karl. Best to live." They tear a strip of cloth from a white undershirt, tie it to the end of a rifle, and raise it above the ruined armor. Within minutes, American infantry from the 106th Division surround them. "Hands up, drop it," shouts a soldier, his accent sharp and flat, like nothing Karl has ever heard. The German men obey, stepping from behind the wreckage with their arms raised high. The Americans move efficiently, rifles steady, eyes watchful but not cruel. One corporal approaches, checks their pockets, and waves them toward a column of other prisoners trudging down the road. As they march, Karl notices something odd. The American guards offer the prisoners water. One even tosses a cigarette to an older sergeant. The gesture feels unreal. In Nazi propaganda, Americans were depicted as degenerates, mongrels of greed and chaos. Yet here, in the snow of the Ardennes, their captors act more like soldiers than monsters. The German men glance at each other in silence. None know what awaits them, but, for the first time in months, Karl feels something unexpected: relief. That night they are herded into a makeshift enclosure, a barbed wire pen lit by truck headlights. The snow has turned to mud. Karl curls up beneath a wool blanket tossed by a U.S. guard. He stares at the sky, where the last traces of artillery smoke fade into darkness. Somewhere in that silence, he realizes he is alive. Over the coming weeks, the prisoners are processed, searched, tagged, and catalogued. Some are sent to British-run camps in France. Others, like Karl, are loaded onto ships bound for a destination that sounds impossible: America. The voyage is long and rough. Packed into the hold of the SS James Parker, hundreds of German POWs endure the Atlantic's winter swells. Yet even here there are surprises. The food is plain, but filling: meat, bread, coffee. The guards speak little, but seem almost casual, even friendly. "You'll get your rest soon," one tells them. The men laugh bitterly at the thought. For years they had been told that Allied prisoners were starved and beaten. The contradiction gnaws at them. 2 weeks later, as dawn breaks, a cry echoes through the hold. On land, the men rush to the narrow portholes. A distant coastline glows beneath the rising sun, statues, smokestacks, and wide stretches of snow-dusted fields. America. They dock in Norfolk, Virginia. As the prisoners step ashore, U.S. Army trucks line the pier, their sides stenciled with white letters, PW, prisoner of war. American soldiers direct the Germans calmly, almost politely, into the vehicles. The convoy rumbles inland through small towns, where curious children wave and housewives pause on porches to stare. The prisoners, once feared invaders, are now objects of curiosity. Hours later, they arrive at a vast compound, surrounded by fences, but not walls. Inside, there are rows of wooden barracks, a canteen, even a small chapel. A sign reads, "Camp Swift, War Prisoner, Camp Number 2. As they step from the trucks, the smell of cooked food drifts through the cold air. It is beef-rich, savory, unmistakable. Weber's stomach clenches. At the mess hall, guards serve them steaming trays, steak potatoes, green beans and bread still warm from the oven. There are cigarettes too, American brands with bright packaging and smooth flavor. The Germans eat in silence, glancing at each other in disbelief. Weber murmurs, "This cannot be real." Beside him, Miller grins weakly. If this is captivity, may it last the rest of the war. That night, lying on a clean cot under a real roof, Carl cannot sleep. The sounds are strange, the hum of distant generators, the creak of wooden beams, the laughter of American guards outside. Somewhere, a radio plays a soft jazz tune. He closes his eyes, unsure whether he is dreaming or waking into another world. January 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The air is dry, the night's cold, and the landscape stretches endlessly, a far cry from the bombed ruins of Cologne or Hamburg. Rows of wooden barracks glimmer under the morning sun, each marked with neat white numbers. Inside, hundreds of captured German soldiers begin their new routine roll call. Breakfast, labor assignments, rest. Karl Weber wakes to the sharp blast of a bugle. For a moment, his old instincts flare. He expects shouting punishment, the brutality of discipline. But instead, an American sergeant simply walks through the aisle, clipboard in hand, ticking off names. "Morning, fellas," the man says in an easy drawl. "You're up for work detail at 8. No barking orders, no blows. Just a nod and a pencil." Outside, the camp is unexpectedly calm. Guards in khaki stand watch at the gates, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, chatting with one another. Within the fences, POWs move freely between mess halls, workshops, and recreation yards. Some even stroll unescorted toward the fields where they tend small vegetable gardens the U.S. Army has allowed them to plant. Carl joins a group assigned to maintain the camp's motor pool. His task cleaning wrenches, sorting tools, keeping engines free of dust. The sergeant overseeing them, a broad-shouldered man named Donnelly, treats the prisoners like apprentices rather than enemies. "Do it right," he tells them, "and you might learn something useful for when you go home." During breaks, Donnelly sometimes lights a cigarette, offers one to Carl, and asks halting questions. "Where you from?" "Cologne, right, big city." Carl nods, unsure how much to say. But Donnelly smiles anyway. "Heard it was beautiful once." To the German prisoners, the camp begins to feel like another planet. There is structure, yes, but also a strange gentleness. They eat 3 times a day, eggs and coffee at breakfast, thick stew for lunch, steak, or pork chops for dinner. The rations match those of American troops. It is not luxury, but after years of scarcity and propaganda, it feels unthinkable. At night, the men gather outside the barracks to smoke and talk. Some speak quietly about the war, what cities have fallen, who might still be alive. Others debate whether this soft treatment is a trick. Sergeant Miller insists that it must be psychological warfare. "They want to break us," he says. "Make us think we are the monsters." But his tone carries doubt. Days turn into weeks, and the rhythm of camp life deepens. There are movie screenings on weekends, Hollywood films projected onto a white sheet, Casablanca's stage door canteen. The POWs sit cross-legged in the dirt, laughing at scenes they barely understand, mesmerized by the glamour. There are soccer matches too, played on makeshift fields. Americans sometimes join in. For a moment, uniforms blur. The Geneva Convention, something most of the prisoners had never even heard of before, governs nearly every aspect of their lives. Each man receives medical care if sick or injured. Red Cross inspectors visit monthly, ensuring fair treatment. Letters from home are delivered through military post. Carl's first arrives in February, a thin envelope with his mother's handwriting. She writes that Cologne lies in ruins, that food is scarce, that she prays every day he is safe. Reading those words, Carl feels the distance between worlds more sharply than ever. He is safer here in the enemy's country than his own family under the Reich. One afternoon, Carl's work team is sent to a nearby farm outside the camp's wire. They are to pick cotton and repair fences under the supervision of 2 guards. The farmer, a stooped man in overalls, offers them lemonade. "Never thought I'd have Germans in my field," he jokes. The POWs laugh awkwardly, but the warmth in his voice is genuine. He pays their labor in coupons redeemable for soap, toothpaste, or extra tobacco at the camp canteen. Later, as the sun sets over the Texas plains, Carl sits by the fence and watches the horizon turn gold. He thinks of his comrades still fighting, starving, freezing somewhere in the ruins of Europe. Here he has food, shelter, and a strange sense of dignity. The contradiction unsettles him. That night, he writes in a small notebook he's been keeping since capture. "The Americans feed us more than our own army ever did. I no longer know who the civilized ones are." Rumors circulate of other camps across the United States, hundreds of them from Georgia to California. Some hold Italians, others Japanese, but most are Germans like him. There are stories of men sent north to harvest timber in Minnesota or south to canning factories in Alabama. In each tale, the pattern repeats: fair rations, humane treatment, respect. For the guards, it is not idealism, but duty. The United States wants to uphold its international image to show the world, and especially the Axis nations, that democracy fights clean. The rules of the Geneva Convention are not just legal obligations. They are moral weapons in a war of ideologies. But for men like Carl, the effect is more intimate. The enemy's humanity becomes undeniable. When American soldiers share food or joke with them, it chips away at years of indoctrination. Even the sound of American radio swing music baseball scores. Roosevelt's speeches begins to humanize the face of the other side. One evening, as a storm rolls over the camp, lightning flashing beyond the wire, Carl turns to Miller and says quietly, "If the world ever ends again, maybe it will be built by men who learned not to hate." Miller does not answer, but for the first time, he does not argue either. Spring 1945. The war in Europe is breaking apart, though word of it reaches Camp Swift slowly like ripples across a vast sea. Newspapers arrive each week, passed from one barrack to another, until they are nothing but creased, oil-stained rags. Russians enter Berlin. Allies cross the Rhine. Hitler dead. The headlines come in bursts, each one pulling a little more air from the lungs of the Reich. For the men behind the wire, disbelief gives way to quiet reckoning. Some rejoice the end of the slaughter. Others fall into stunned silence. To admit defeat is to confront the collapse of everything they were taught to believe: the glory of the fatherland, the invincibility of its armies, the destiny of its people. Karl Weber sits on his bunk, the paper in his hands, trembling. Across from him, Miller stares at the floor. "Then it is finished," Miller mutters. "All of it." Outside, the American guards go about their duties as usual. The mess hall still serves hot meals. The canteen still plays swing records. But among the prisoners, a strange weight settles, a mixture of shame, confusion, and relief. No one knows what the end of the war will mean for them. Will they be shipped back to a ruined Germany, put on trial, forgotten? A week later, the camp commander, a tall officer named Captain Riley, calls an assembly. The prisoners gather on the parade ground, their breath hanging in the morning air. Riley stands before them with a translator. "Gentlemen," he begins, "the war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally." A murmur runs through the crowd. Riley continues, "You are now prisoners of peace. Your treatment will not change. You will remain here until repatriation is arranged. The United States will honor its obligations under the Geneva Convention. In the meantime, you will continue to work and live as before." The speech is brief but solemn. No gloating, no humiliation. When it ends, Riley salutes them, a small, precise gesture of respect between soldiers. For Carl, that salute burns more deeply than any insult could. In the following days, life resumes with subtle changes. The guards seem more relaxed, the fences less watched. German officers among the POWs lose their authority as uniforms fade into mere fabric. Men begin to speak more freely, even critically, of the regime they once served. Camp Swift becomes a kind of mirror, one that reflects a broken nation back to its sons. In the absence of propaganda, the prisoners fill the void with memory and doubt. Some form discussion groups. Others start classes teaching English or mechanics. A few organize church services, though even faith feels uncertain now. One evening, Carl sits by the barrack window watching fireflies dance beyond the wire. He hears laughter, German and American voices mingling near the canteen. It is subtle but profound, and the war's great division softening into something almost human. Weeks later, the camp welcomes a visitor from the War Department's Psychological Operations Division. Edward Sanders, a bespectacled civilian in a rumpled suit, interviews prisoners for a study on morale. "We want to understand how you see us," he explains through a translator. "Your experience here." Carl hesitates before answering. "You treat us like men," he says finally. "That is more powerful than any weapon." Sanders scribbles a note, nodding. That he murmurs is exactly the point. What the prisoners do not yet realize is that America's generosity serves a dual purpose. The government hopes to demonstrate moral superiority not only for the record of history, but for the future of Germany itself. When these men return home, they will carry with them the memory of humane treatment, a living contrast to the cruelty of their own regime. It is re-education through decency. Meanwhile, daily life in the camp grows strangely normal. The Red Cross delivers soccer balls, books, even musical instruments. A POW orchestra forms performing concerts on weekends. American soldiers come to listen, clapping after each piece. Some prisoners write plays, others paint murals on the walls of their barracks, images of home, of rivers and forests untouched by war. But not all find peace so easily. A handful of die-hard Nazis, still loyal to the lost cause, accuse others of betrayal. They whisper of secret vengeance, of a coming resurrection of the Reich. The camp authorities, aware of this tension, quietly separate the radicals from the moderates. Carl finds himself drifting toward the latter. He joins a group that studies English and American civics. Their teacher, a corporal from Ohio named Stevens, uses a chalkboard salvaged from a schoolhouse. Freedom. Stevens writes one morning means responsibility. He pauses, then adds, "You can disagree without fear." The Germans stare at the word freedom, unsure how to define it. That night, Carl lies awake listening to the hum of crickets and distant trains. He remembers the propaganda posters back home, grim faces, Iron Eagle's slogans demanding obedience. Here, the enemy gives him books, respect, and choices. The contradiction grows heavier each day, pressing against everything he once believed. Outside, thunder rumbles across the Texas plains. Rain begins to fall, drumming softly on the tin roofs of the barracks. For the first time since capture, Carl sleeps without dreams. By late summer of 1945, the Texas heat pressed down like an anvil, baking the ground into dust. Camp Swift shimmered under the sun, its fences glinting like molten wire. The war was over. The fighting had stopped, yet the camp remained alive, a strange half-world between freedom and captivity. For Private Carl Weber, each day now began without fear. The sirens of war were gone. The rhythm of camp life had replaced them. He woke shaved with American soap and joined the line for breakfast. Powdered eggs, bacon, coffee so strong it could raise the dead, one guard joked. Across the room, someone played a harmonica, Lily Marlene, soft and low. The men had grown tan and lean. They wore khaki work clothes marked PW in bold black letters. Some helped build roads for the county. Others harvested crops for nearby farms. The war economy had left the U.S. short of labor, and the POWs filled that gap under strict supervision, but surprising trust. Guards often lounged in the shade, while Germans worked the fields chatting with them between rows of corn. One day, Carl was assigned to load hay bales at a ranch outside Bastrop. The rancher, Mr. Allen, a broad man with sun-bleached hair, greeted them with a nod. "You boys ever handle cattle?" he asked. When Miller shook his head, Allen laughed. "You'll learn fast." By noon, the prisoners were sweating their shirts, soaked their hands raw. But Allen's wife brought them lemonade, and for a brief, impossible moment, it felt like they belonged. At lunch, Allen sat beside them under a tree. "My boy fought in Europe," he said quietly. "Somewhere near Aachen, I think." He looked at Carl. "Could have been you on the other side." Carl lowered his eyes. "Perhaps," he said. Allen took a drag from his cigarette. "Well, war's done now. Best we can do is fix what's left." It was not forgiveness, exactly. But it was something close. Back at camp, an unexpected transformation unfolded. The prisoners began running their own library, staffed by volunteers. Shelves filled with donated books, Goethe, Dickens, Steinbeck, even a German translation of Mice and Men. The U.S. Army allowed it, even encouraged it, under the belief that reading could rehabilitate minds scarred by propaganda. Lectures followed, civics lessons, debates about democracy and freedom. Some Germans mocked it as brainwashing, others listened. Carl listened. He began to see patterns in the lessons, not indoctrination, but questions. Why obey authority? What is justice without fear? What does victory mean when humanity is lost? The camp psychologist, Lieutenant Sanders, invited volunteers for discussions. "You are not enemies anymore," he told them. "You are men rebuilding yourselves." During one session, Carl raised his hand. If what we believed was wrong, he asked, "Why did so many of us believe it?" Sanders replied, "Because it promised order. But order built on fear never lasts." Outside, the world was changing faster than any of them could imagine. Japan surrendered in August. Cities across America erupted in celebration fireworks, parades, flags. The prisoners watched from behind the wire, listening to radios crackling with Roosevelt's successor's words, "Peace has come to the world." But peace brought new questions. What would happen now? Some POWs feared retribution in Germany. Others dreamed of staying in America. A rumor spread that a few men might be allowed to remain as farmhands. It was untrue, but it revealed how deeply they had come to prefer their captors' country to their own. The Red Cross began preparing repatriation lists. Names were called, numbers checked. But the process was slow. Ships were scarce, Europe still chaotic. Months turned into another year. By 1946, Camp Swift no longer felt like a prison. Barbed wire still glimmered in the sun, yet its meaning had faded. Guards played cards with prisoners. German carpenters built furniture for nearby schools. A small POW newspaper circulated, written in German, printed with Army ink. Its first headline read, "Zukunft, Future." Still under the quiet surface, guilt lingered. The news from home was unbearable. Cities flattened, families lost, millions displaced. Letters carried stories of hunger and despair. Some men wept in private, unable to reconcile the comfort of their captivity with the suffering of their homeland. Carl received a second letter from his mother. It was brief. "Your father did not survive the last raid. The house is gone. I live with your aunt now. Stay safe, my son. Maybe America is better." He read it again and again until the paper tore at the creases. That night he sat outside the barracks under the wide Texan sky and whispered, "Maybe she's right." The stars overhead were brighter than he had ever seen. He thought of the propaganda posters that had once promised glory through conquest. How hollow those words felt now compared to a simple truth, dignity through decency. For Carl and thousands like him, captivity had become a classroom. They had entered America as soldiers of a defeated empire and were slowly leaving as men humbled by kindness. Spring 1946. The magnolias bloomed along the fences of Camp Swift, and the air was heavy with the scent of grass and diesel. The camp was quieter now, fewer men, fewer guards, fewer routines. Each week, another truckload of prisoners departed for the coast, bound for ships that would take them home to a country they barely recognized. Karl Weber's name finally appeared on the repatriation list, pinned outside the administration office. The paper fluttered in the wind names, typed in neat American letters, each one a life about to cross the ocean. He traced his finger along the page until he found his Weber Karl PW, number 1847, destination Bremerhaven, Germany. He felt no joy, not yet. Just a strange stillness. Around him, men shouted, laughed, cried, hugged. Miller clapped him on the back. "We are going home, my friend. Home." But what was home now? The Germany Karl had left was ashes. Its flags burned, its leaders dead, its cities ghosts. In their place, uncertainty, occupation, survival. The last days in camp passed like scenes from a fading film. Guards shook hands with the prisoners. Some gave away their watches or photographs. Captain Riley, the same officer who had once saluted them at the surrender, stood at the gate as each man boarded the trucks. "Good luck," he said quietly. "Build something better." The convoy rolled out at dawn. The barbed wire fell behind them, glinting like old scars in the morning sun. For many of the men, including Karl, it was the first time they had seen the open road in nearly 2 years. The trucks drove through Texas fields past towns with neon diners and billboards advertising new cars, a nation already dreaming of peace, while Europe still mourned. At the port of New York, they boarded the Liberty ship James Madison, its deck crowded with khaki and sea bags. As the vessel pulled away, Manhattan rose in the distance, a skyline of steel and hope. Some men stood at the rail silent. Others sang old songs in low voices. Karl looked back one last time. The city shimmered in the sunrise. America, he murmured half to himself. A strange enemy. The journey across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. The sea was calm, but the conversations restless. The men spoke of homecomings that might not exist, houses bombed, wives, remarried children grown. They also spoke of the future rebuilding learning, maybe even writing letters to the guards who had become their friends. When they finally reached Bremerhaven, the shock was overwhelming. The harbor was little more than ruins and cranes. The air smelled of ash and salt. On shore, the Allied authorities processed the returnees. Each man was deloused, questioned, and given a ration card and a train ticket. As Karl stepped off the gangway, he saw the German Red Cross workers waiting with blankets and tea. One of them, a woman no older than 20, handed him a small loaf of bread. "Willkommen zurück," she said, "welcome back." Her eyes were tired but kind. On the train south toward Cologne, devastation unfurled mile by mile. Towns were flattened, bridges twisted like broken bones. The once proud Rhine flowed through a landscape of ruins. People walked the tracks, pushing carts piled with scrap and memories. When Karl reached what had been his neighborhood, he found only rubble. His mother's letter had been true, the house was gone, reduced to dust, and a single brick fireplace standing like a gravestone. He stood there for a long time, clutching the soil until it stained his hands. Days later, he found his mother living in a crowded apartment with relatives. She was thinner, older, but alive. When she saw him, she froze, and then wept, clinging to him like a child. "You look healthy," she said through tears. "Too healthy." He could not explain it. How could he, that in America the prisoners had eaten steak while their families starved? That the enemy had shown them mercy while their own nation devoured itself? The guilt was too heavy to name. Life after captivity was harder than any of them had imagined. The returning POWs were often met with suspicion. Some Germans saw them as tainted men who had gone soft in enemy hands. Others resented them for surviving. There were few jobs, less food, and little sympathy. Carl took work repairing rail lines under the British occupation zone. He kept his head down, his mouth shut, and his memories to himself. Yet sometimes when the trains rolled west and the horizon glowed red at sunset, he thought of Texas, of the camp, the laughter, the strange kindness that had defied war. In 1947, he received a letter postmarked from the United States. It was from Corporal Stevens, his English teacher from Camp Swift. Inside was a short note and a photograph of the Texas plains. "Carl Vermeerwampers, hope you are well. The camp is gone now. All that's left are the foundations. I kept one of your notebooks. Your question still haunts me. Why did so many believe? Maybe the answer is that belief can be both a weapon and a wound. Take care, my friend. Stevens." Carl folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket. That night, for the first time since returning home, he allowed himself to remember without bitterness. The fences of Camp Swift had fallen, but their lessons had not. Autumn 1947. The Rhine Valley lay quiet again. Vineyards crept cautiously back over the hillsides, and the air carried the smell of smoke and coal from rebuilt chimneys. But beneath the fragile calm, Germany was a nation learning to live with its own reflection. For men like Karl Weber, the hardest battles began after the shooting stopped. The war had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun. He worked long days for meager pay repairing rail lines under British supervision. At night he slept in a bunkhouse with other displaced men, former soldiers, widowers, boys, too young to have fought, but old enough to starve. They did not speak of the past. Not because they had forgotten, but because the words themselves felt dangerous. Now and then, posters appeared on walls calling for witnesses to testify in denazification hearings. Some names were familiar: former officers, neighbors, teachers. The radio spoke of trials in Nuremberg, of men in suits defending the indefensible. When Carl heard the word Auschwitz for the first time, he turned off the radio and sat in silence. It was not that he had known, not exactly. Few ordinary soldiers had. But he felt the tremor of guilt all the same, a collective burden that seemed to settle over the land like fog. One evening, as the shift ended, Miller appeared at the rail yard. He looked older, thinner, his uniform replaced by a patched civilian coat. "You survived," Carl said. Miller gave a weary smile. "We all survived something." They shared bread and cheap coffee in a bombed-out canteen. Miller spoke of his own return, the stairs, the silence, the hunger. "The Americans fed us better than our own people do now," he said bitterly. "Strange world." Carl nodded. "Maybe that is the point." Miller frowned. "What point?" "That civilization is measured by how you treat those you do not have to treat well." Miller looked at him, startled by the thought. "You sound like one of their teachers." "Maybe I am," Carl said softly. "Maybe that is not so bad." In the following months, Carl's old campmates drifted back into contact. Letters arrived from across the occupation zones, men who had been at Camp Swift now scattered from Hamburg to Munich. They wrote of rebuilding, of confusion, of the strange nostalgia for their captivity. Some even sent pictures, soccer teams in ragged uniforms, families standing before half-repaired houses. One letter from a man named Otto carried a haunting line. In Texas, I learned what freedom tastes like, and it was served with coffee and respect. By 1948, the U.S. had launched the Marshall Plan, flooding Europe with aid. American trucks rumbled through the streets of Cologne, delivering flower tools and hope. To Carl, their presence felt like an echo from Camp Swift, the same olive drab color, the same discipline, but now without the rifles. The occupiers had become helpers. That winter, he began teaching English at a small trade school. His lessons were simple words and phrases picked up from the camp work: respect, responsibility, freedom. The students, most of them young men too young to have fought, listened with quiet fascination. To them, English was not just a language. It was a door. Sometimes he told them stories, small ones, about the farm where he picked cotton, about the sergeant who gave him cigarettes, about the American who said that freedom meant responsibility. He never spoke of shame, only of lessons. Still, some nights guilt returned. He would dream of his father, of the ruins of the quiet in the camp after the news of surrender. He would wake sweating, unsure which world had been real, the one that had starved him with pride, or the one that fed him with decency. Years passed. Germany changed. The Wirtschaftswunder, then the economic miracle, began to lift the nation from its ashes. New buildings rose. New governments promised democracy and dignity. Yet for thousands of former POWs, the war never truly ended. It lived on in memory, in quiet comparisons between what they had endured and what they had learned abroad. In 1952, a journalist from a Cologne newspaper began collecting accounts from returned prisoners. When he interviewed Carl, he asked, "What was it like in America? Were you treated well?" Carl hesitated. "Better than I deserved," he said finally. "Better than most men deserve in war." The journalist pressed on. "And what did you learn from that?" Carl looked out the window at the rebuilt streets, the children playing, the women sweeping porches, the sound of church bells returning to the air. "That mercy," he said slowly, "is stronger than victory." His words would later appear in print, buried deep in the article. But for Carl, it was not publicity that mattered. It was the truth, a truth earned not through ideology or conquest, but through the quiet dignity of survival. By the mid-1950s, Camp Swift no longer existed. The land had been returned to Texas ranchers, the barracks dismantled, the fences melted down. Only the foundations remained half buried under grass and time. But in Germany, in kitchens and classrooms and quiet conversations, its spirit endured, a living paradox, that war had somehow created peace, if only in the hearts of those who had seen both sides. Carl never returned to America. But in his small apartment in Cologne, he kept one framed photograph on the wall, a faded black and white image of the Texas plains sent years ago by Corporal Stevens. On the back, written in pencil, were two words: "Never forget." He never did. By the early 1960s, 2 decades had passed since the surrender. Yet the echoes of captivity still rippled quietly through the lives of those who had once worn the PW armband. Germany was reborn, modern, humming, industrious, but the men who had lived through its darkest years carried invisible scars. Karl Weber, now in his 40s, taught English full-time at a secondary school near Bonn. His students were children of the new West Germany, the generation that had grown up amid concrete reconstruction and American jazz, not air raids and propaganda. They called him Herr Weber, but to them the war was only a rumor, something their parents refused to talk about. In class, he spoke not of battles, but of words. He taught them freedom, conscience, truth. Simple words heavy with the weight of what he had seen. When a student once asked, "Were you a soldier?" he paused before answering, "Yes. But more importantly, I was a prisoner, and that taught me more than war ever could." Sometimes after lessons, he would take the tram into the city where American and German businessmen now dined together in cafes once bombed to rubble. Coca-Cola signs glowed where banners had once hung. The irony was not lost on him. The same country that had captured him had also helped rebuild his homeland. One winter, a letter arrived bearing a return address from Texas. It was from the son of Corporal Stevens the American, who had once taught him English in Camp Swift. The letter explained that Stevens had passed away the year before. Among his things, they had found Carl's old notebook, the one with the quote about civilization. The family wanted him to have it back. When Carl opened the package, the smell of old paper and salt filled the air. Inside, his own handwriting stared back at him. The Americans feed us more than our own army ever did. I no longer know who the civilized ones are. He ran a hand over the words now, faint with age. Beneath them was a photograph. Stevens' smiling hat tilted back, standing beside a wooden fence in the Texas sun. On the back was written, "To Carl, so you remember that fences are only temporary." That night, Carl sat at his desk, lit only by a small lamp, and wrote a reply to Stevens' family. "Your father was my teacher when I was a prisoner. He gave me more than words, he gave me understanding. I have tried to pass that on to my own students. Please know that the kindness of one man helped heal what an entire war had broken." He never knew if the letter reached them, but he kept the notebook close, often reading it, on evenings when the news from the world grew dark again: Korea, Hungary, Cuba. Each new crisis felt like a test. Had humanity truly learned? In the mid-1960s, Carl was invited to a reunion of former German POWs. It was held in Munich, in a small hall filled with aging men and faded uniforms. Some brought wives, others brought stories. One man had become a doctor, another a mayor. All of them, in their own way, had built something from the ruins. As they shared memories, the conversation turned again and again to America, to the camps, the food, the strange fairness of their captors. One man joked, "They fattened us up so we'd rebuild their Europe." Another replied quietly, "Maybe they just wanted us to see what humanity looks like." Carl raised his glass. "To those who showed us mercy," he said. The room fell silent for a moment, and then the glasses clinked softly. The years rolled on. By the 1970s, West Germany had become an economic powerhouse, allied with the same United States that had once held its sons behind wire. For most, the past faded into textbooks and memorials. But for the former POWs, it remained a living memory, a contradiction that defined their moral compass for the rest of their lives. When Carl retired in 1978, the school held a small ceremony. His students presented him with a gift, a framed map of the world, marked with the countries he had taught them about. In the corner, one small pin stood out Texas. He smiled. "That," he said, "is where I learned that war can end long before peace begins." In the final years of his life, Carl often visited the Rhine on quiet mornings. The river, eternal and indifferent, reminded him of the Atlantic crossing so many years before, when he had returned to a broken homeland with a full stomach and a troubled heart. He died in 1983, at home surrounded by books and letters. Among his belongings, his students found the Texas photograph, the old notebook, and a single line written in English: "Mercy remembers what victory forgets." Decades after Karl Weber's death, the story of men like him slipped quietly into the folds of history. The world had moved on, new wars, new alliances, new divisions. But the quiet experiment that had taken place behind barbed wire on American soil still whispered through archives, diaries, and fading letters. By the 1990s, historians began to look again at the vast network of German POW camps that once dotted the United States. There had been more than 400 of them, stretching from Maine to California, housing over 400,000 captured soldiers. What had once been a temporary wartime necessity was now being re-examined as something extraordinary, a moral paradox in an age of destruction. Documentaries unearthed photographs of smiling young men in khaki overalls posing beside American guards. Declassified reports confirmed that the United States had followed the Geneva Convention with near-religious precision, even when resources were stretched thin. POWs had been given the same rations as American soldiers' access to medical care and opportunities for education. In one archival photograph, researchers discovered a familiar face, a young man identified as Weber K., working at a camp motor pool in Texas, 1945. The image showed him wiping grease from his hands, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Beneath the photo, a caption written by an American lieutenant read simply, "Decent men on both sides." Scholars found in these camps a reflection of America's self-image. At war's end, a country determined to prove that democracy could conquer tyranny not through vengeance, but through restraint. The humane treatment of prisoners became a cornerstone of post-war diplomacy cited in Geneva and The Hague as evidence that moral power could outlast military might. But for the men who had lived it, the lesson was deeply personal. Oral histories recorded in the 1980s and 1990s revealed recurring phrases. They treated us like humans. We learned more from the Americans than from our own officers. It was there that I stopped believing in hate. In Cologne, one of Karl's former students, now a teacher himself, kept his mentor's photograph on his desk. He often told his own pupils the story of the man who learned freedom in captivity. When asked if it was true, he would smile and say, "True enough to matter." The ripples extended far beyond Germany. Across Europe, the POWs who had returned from America became quiet ambassadors of a different worldview. Their voices influenced Reconstruction moderation and the fragile trust between former enemies. Some even corresponded with their old guards, for decades exchanging Christmas cards and family photos. One letter preserved in the National Archives came from a former Camp Swift prisoner to an American sergeant in Kansas. "You once gave me a cigarette. I did not smoke it. Then I kept it because it was the first time an enemy offered me something with kindness. I still have the pack unopened. It reminds me that peace begins with small things. Those small things multiplied over the years, gestures, stories, acts of remembrance. And together, they wove a quiet legacy stronger than treaties. By the turn of the century, Camp Swift itself had long since vanished. The land was reclaimed by ranchers and wildlife, the barracks reduced to outlines in the grass. Only a small historical marker remained placed there by a local historical society in 1998. It read, "Camp Swift, established 1942. Housed over 10,000 German POWs during World War II. Remembered for its humanity in wartime." Every year, a handful of visitors stopped by historians, descendants, veterans' families. Some came out of curiosity, others out of gratitude. The wind across the plains carried the faint hum of the past, the laughter of young men speaking German and English, the clatter of mess trays, the slow creak of the Texas sun over the wire. Among the archives of the German Red Cross, Karl Weber's name appeared on a single index card, neatly typed, "Returned, 1946. Status alive. Occupation, after-war teacher." It was an unremarkable entry in a sea of records, yet behind it lay the quiet truth of what captivity had done, not just to him, but to an entire generation. In classrooms across Germany, in museums and films, the story began to resurface, not as propaganda or nostalgia, but as testimony. It challenged the simple binaries of good and evil, enemy and ally. It reminded people that the moral battlefield of war does not end when the guns fall silent. It continues in the choices we make afterward. If you stand on the grounds where Camp Swift once stood, you would find nothing but grass cicadas and the wind moving through mesquite trees. But listen closely, and it feels as though the past still breathes there, steady, patient, unashamed of its complexity. The wire is gone. The lessons remain.